Now, I don't have anywhere near as good of a presentation in terms of slides as Tom does. His pictures are amazing. I need to do that next time. So I'm just going to talk with you because I can't compete with that. So first of all, I want to say this is like an incredible event that you guys have put together. One of the things that I find so fascinating about what some of the work that Tom has done is like you're talking about issues that aren't really talked about. Like you're shining a light on something I think that has been going on kind of in the shadows with these types of special economic zones. Not shadows in a pejorative sense, but in a sort of under noticed sense, and that I think could have a very powerful impact on the future. There's a lot of kind of scholars out there talking about there's sort of an erosion of the nation state that seems to be happening where big cities are replacing, are the major providers of governance. And I think special jurisdictions and other types of sort of like what we think of now as sort of informal type arrangements are going to play a bigger and bigger role. And the special international zone concept is one is something like that we're seeing, because we see more and more as society evolves, it seems like we're always trying to come up, the law tries to follow progress as it happens, and we tend to define, we're always kind of reshaping the boundaries of things based on the practical realities that we see around us. And so we see this like with these special international zones where governments are thinking, gosh, these people are here, but we can't give them the full panoply of rights that are owed to people within our borders, so we're going to do this limited bundle of rights. Or with special economic zones, we're seeing this more and more. It's like it's not really practical to be, this is the way it started in the 1930s. It's not really practical to be applying these huge tariff rates because we're just killing ourselves on imported goods. So, well, we'll create an area and we'll say it's outside the customs territory of the country. That's the way it's defined. So my idea is the Refugee Cities concept, which is, you're right. I mean, it's just sort of like this fits within the special international zone mold. However, what we want to do with it is create a space, like Tom was saying, that where you're not stripping away freedoms from people. In other words, with like we saw at Charles de Gaulle Airport, it's like you get all of the disadvantages of being in France and none of the advantages, right, of being all the burdens and none of the benefits. What a refugee city would do would be to take a population that otherwise would be excluded from certain benefits of being within a country, such as the right to work primarily, or the right to own property, and other benefits. That, for instance, if a country is putting them in a refugee camp, which is one of the common traditional responses to refugees, they have access to food, medical care, some degree of education, some degree of safety, but that's not all that's needed over the long term for people. On average, people spend, well over 10 years of their life. People who are refugees will spend well over 10 years of their life living in a refugee camp, where they're not legally allowed, oftentimes, to use their skills. And this is a huge disadvantage, not just for the refugees themselves who are not able to be productive, but it's a huge lost opportunity for the countries that are hosting them. Because when you take this population that would be extremely productive on the labor market and force them out of the labor market, then you're not getting to take advantage of the value of their labor that they could be contributing. And so what Refugee Cities does is it creates a special zone in which refugees would be legal, and migrants generally would be legally allowed to work who would otherwise not be able to work within the country. So that could be an existing refugee camp that is designated as a zone where certain work permits with conditional work permits that allow people to work within this zone or to start businesses within the zone or it could be empty land that is developed like on a greenfield site, like many special economic zones are, where there's a developer that buys the land, owns the land, and provides services there, and refugees, along with the host population, are legally allowed to work. It could be taking an existing village or community or an informal settlement with a huge migrant population, allowing them to work within the area. And like all special economic zones, I think, this was sort of a theme, I think, in Lada's talk also, was that this is a lesser alternative to nationwide reform, right? We want to do in a special economic zone, good special economic zones, take the direction that a country should go in terms of policy and governance, but can't go because of political roadblocks, because there's too many entrenched interests holding on to the status quo, and so you pilot, you test or innovate these reforms, incubate them within a zone. So with special economic zones, we've done that with trade and tax for a long time. Done it increasingly, especially since China in the 1980s and 90s, increasingly with a broader range of policy areas like labor and business licensing and construction permitting and so forth. Refugee Cities does that in the immigration space. Particularly, and where this would be probably where we're seeing the most progress are these sort of quote-unquote frontline countries that are taking in huge influxes of refugees, whether from Syria or sub-Saharan Africans coming up into northern Africa, or countries like Iran, which have huge populations of Afghan refugees, as well as countries with large internally displaced populations too. But these are the countries that are kind of have the most at stake. You know, they have a huge population living there, and they have a choice of what are they going to do. Are they going to try to put them all into a camp where they be given tents and food and so forth, and hopefully they stay happy? Or are they going to allow these people to thrive and allow the country to thrive off allowing these people to contribute to it? And one of the common kind of responses to this, and this is one of the totally legitimate critiques of what we see with a lot of current migrant zones, detention centers and so forth, are that they are exclusive. In other words, they sort of shove people off and say, stay over here and stay away from everybody else. They segregate people. A refugee city is designed as a step towards integration, towards integrating refugees into the economy, into the normal life of a country, but doesn't require the country to go all the way into admitting them formally, to work anywhere in the country. And hopefully by doing that, we can get a lot more people much more immediate access to self-sufficiency than we would have if we spent the next 100 years trying to push nations to integrate refugees more into their economies. So that's the broad concept. I can touch on a little bit of the law and the paper that I wrote for this. I looked at some of the law covering refugees, both at the international level and the domestic level. So internationally, there is a Refugee Convention, as Tom mentioned. The 1951 Refugee Convention was drafted after World War II, in which it was done in response to huge huge displaced populations after World War II, and it had actually grants just a broad range of rights for refugees. So if you have somebody living within your borders that qualifies as a refugee, and a refugee is defined as somebody living outside of the country of their nationality who's unable to avail themselves of the protections of their home country because for reasons of their race, religion, what other ones? There's a few
Political
other
views also.
political views, membership in a particular social group, and other types of things. In other words, if you're being persecuted for those reasons, you get status as a refugee. One of those rights under the convention as a refugee is that the country has to allow you as much access to employment as it does to the most favored non-citizen of the country. So in other words, you look at all the non-citizens of the country, and what is the or sorry, I shouldn't say non-citizens, all the foreign nationals. What is the most freedom that they give in terms of work rights to one of the foreign national? You have to give that to a refugee as well. And also, if the country has adopted laws that say, we're not allowing foreign nationals to work in certain sectors because we want to protect these for our own citizens. If a refugee has been in the country for 3 years, they have to be given access to those sectors too. In other words, those laws don't apply to them. So that's what the law says. However, for those who study international law, we know that it's not nearly as clean as that. And there's no enforcement body, for instance, for most international law. But also, countries have a lot of freedom to carve out exemptions for themselves. So out of the Refugee Convention, there's 145 countries that are members of the Refugee Convention. About half of them have made reservations, in other words, like little exemptions for themselves in terms of work rights for refugees, for instance. And even there, in the paper I talk about Turkey, for instance. Turkey still said, yeah, we're full members of the Refugee Convention, full work rights for refugees and all that. And Turkey, by the way, has about 3 million Syrian refugees in the country, not counting the undocumented ones, which is probably makes the number much higher. So they have about 3 million refugees in the country. But technically, Turkey has said, for the purposes of this convention, we're only going to define a refugee as somebody who that is fleeing a country in Europe, because this is a vestige of World War II, of the original thing. So there's all kinds of, and it's like when you begin to look at each of these individual countries, it's like, oh, it gets a lot more tricky than just what the convention clearly says. And then there's, so, of the major refugee hosting countries like, Lebanon, about a quarter of the people living within its borders are Syrian refugees or Palestinians. And a number of other, Iran has about 1 million refugees. There's about 65.6 million forcibly displaced people, and those are the only people. Those are only people who are documented too. So it's not counting like all of these much more informal situations where we don't really know. People aren't registered on paper. So the number is probably much higher in the world scene. So I think I've. So anyway. My point in saying all that is I think Refugee Cities is sort of a vehicle for helping countries take a step towards compliance with the 1951 Refugee Convention, so with obligations under international law. It's a step towards achieving the original aims of the 1951 Refugee Convention, and on the legal side. And then on the economic policy side, it's a way for countries to begin to benefit from refugees being within their borders, rather than them being a drain on the economy. In situations where migrants generally, but especially refugees, are legally allowed to work, over the medium to long term, they deliver strong net benefits for the country, greatly exceeding the costs in terms of welfare or public services that they consume. So Refugee Cities is a way of helping countries begin to tap into the tremendous potential that comes when you allow people to achieve their dreams, to use their skills. And so that's what we're about.
Thank you. So I will start with a couple of warm-up questions, and then I would like to open it up for audience to ask Professor Bell and Mr. Miller any questions that related to the talk. First, with Refugee City, I have two questions in terms of the details. For example, I know that Europe, the European Union, is working towards, or maybe it has already forged an agreement with Jordan that SEZs that allow Syrian refugees to work in and then have exemption from regular Jordanian labor laws. That if those refugees from Syria go into these SEZs and do work and manufacturing, the products that they produce would be able to be exported to Europe, almost like as a free trade.
Right.
So, in your experience, would the Refugee City SEZ, for it to be deemed a good thing for the host country, that it would have to be coupled with a trade, or is it going to be viewed as, well, you know, we're taking jobs away from our poorest of the Jordanians? So does it need that extra coupling for it to be deemed an incentive?
No, I don't think so, though it certainly can help. As a side note, I mean, the Jordan Compact, which you were referring to, I don't think it's going to deliver that great of an impact, unfortunately, mainly because it only applies to manufactured goods. Jordan's not a great place to do manufacturing. It's not very competitive for it. So it's probably not going to have a big impact on drawing in manufacturers into to Jordan to employ people there. It also it's also a little bit problematic because the Syrians that are in Jordan right now tend to be people from more rural backgrounds and are often less educated, less skilled, and so in the types of manufacturing industries that Jordan is more competitive for require more of a greater skill level. So because most of those people are coming from like agricultural communities and stuff. So, but the idea is a good one. Like we should be doing that more, and I think so. It'd be a very smart thing for developed nations like the EU to be setting up, to be reducing trade barriers, particularly for refugee-inclusive special economic zones, like what's happening in Jordan. You know, that it would be better for the developed countries for multiple reasons. One is it's just better to have more liberal trade, to be reducing trade barriers in general. But also, the idea is that by doing that, there's less pressure for people to be making it into their countries. In other words, for Syrians to be trying to make it to Europe because maybe they can find a good job in Jordan in one of these zones that's attracted a manufacturer because that manufacturer can sell products duty-free in Europe. You know, so that in theory it's a good kind of add-on. But I think that there is a strong enough reason, if we adopt like the best practices of a special economic zone, we're creating a space in which it's much easier to do business. It's a much better place to be attracting industry, and we can do it in a way that doesn't raise the argument of, oh, you're taking jobs away that would go from our own people. Because if you're developing a new plot of land, let's say, or some place where there's not a whole lot of foreign investment happening, and you create a regime there that says this is a great place for economic activity to happen, then you've created new jobs. In other words, by creating a refugee city, you've created jobs that weren't there before, that weren't there for the host country population. So you're creating jobs both for the host country and for refugees, which is what our model is built on. This wouldn't be just like some zone for refugees only and people from the host country don't get to benefit. you're attracting new businesses, creating new jobs that go to both the refugees and the host country, which means that the refugees themselves are the incentive for a host country to do it.
And my next question actually is for both of you. I've been intrigued by a proposition that two professors at Duke University have been exploring. And they wrote a very interesting article called Competing for Refugees. And some of it is based on some of the ideas that we're talking about, SEZs and allowing, using liberal values to create an enclave that would be very beneficial. But they have an additional idea which to me seems extremely radical, and I'm just trying to figure out whether or not you think what your views are normatively and from a strategic, pragmatic perspective, whether or not it could be implemented. And their idea goes like this. If a certain state creates refugees by discriminating against them or persecuting them, and these refugees flee, now nobody wants them. But how can we create a market where people actually want them? And not just because they can be used for labor in an SEZ, let's say, but also because along with them comes a right to be compensated for a violation of an international tort. So it could be an Alien Torts Claims Act type of thing. And then the refugee, so somebody would take their claim, it would be a group claim. And then that group claim would say, okay, you have created a loss of, 100 million. The host country can take up the claim of the refugee and, there would be some dispute mechanism, resolution mechanism. It could be arbitration, it could be the ICJ, something like that. So this is very novel and kind of a moving piece. And sue the state that has created the refugee. But then, using the New York Convention, would be able to just attach the assets of the refugee creating state. So very novel, right?
That's pretty great.
And they've also talked about creating a secondary market so that the state that is the host state can also sell the right to a hedge fund.
Right.
And then that hedge fund would
goodness.
then use it as a sovereign debt, like pursue, like suing Argentina for not paying their bonds would be the same as suing Myanmar, but if it's now trying to get investment as an offset.
And the underlying claim would be like some tort that the refugee sending country
and
caused.
The Foreign Sovereign Immunities
right.
Act takes care of international torts. I mean, you can't claim immunity on tort if you fit certain conditions. What do you think?
That's interesting. Well, I hadn't thought of it before.
Yeah.
It sounds.
Does it sound intriguingly like certainly a liberal, not illiberal, use of?
Sure. Yeah, I like it. You should write a paper on it.
Well, I think it sounds intriguing, but I got to make this observation. A great many of the people that France and Hungary and Germany are dealing with don't really have asylum claims. I don't think it would help, France to say, France, you should take in these people because you'll get to sue Syria. Well, maybe Syria is not a good example. You get to sue, where are they coming from these days? Algeria? Libya?
Yeah.
Libya? Let's say Libya. Yeah. And, but most of them are economic migrants. So they can say, well, what, did you have to flee because someone wanted to throw you in jail because of your religion? No, there are no jobs, and there's really bad health care, and I want my kid to get a good education. That doesn't give rise to any claim under international law. So it might help the really hard cases, and those people need help, but those are the people who already have asylum claims. And if the French system is working right, they show up at the airport, and France treats them rudely and says, give me your claim, and then they go, whoa, all right, you were going to hear, let him in. And then the others, the economic. So that person would be helped, and maybe France would take in that person, but I'm afraid the margin might be pretty small. I don't know, but I'm guessing as a percentage of international migrants, the people who really have asylum claims is probably pretty small.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
There's about 20 million people in the world who have formal status as refugees that like the UNHCR has processed their claims and stuff and said you are a refugee. And so in theory, I mean, you'd have to have evidence that you'd have to prove that the tort committed. So it's not, you're right. It's going to be kind of a small segment of people, but it's still there. Right, yeah, so the Rohingya, so
That's a
you
big-
gather a bunch of evidence that says that the government,
Well, their
It always
theory is also
depends.
that it's going to create disincentives for countries,
Yeah.
knowing you could be sued and not being able to claim immunity.
Yeah.
You're going to think twice about
yeah,
opening yourself up to
And-
being sued economically.
right, right, and then you actually have this like enforcement mechanism for enforcing international norms,
Yeah.
international laws. Yeah.
Mark?
I'm sorry. I can hear you, Mark, but other people speak really softly. So get them started on using the mic. Thank you.
Okay. I'm Mark Frazier with Open World, and I think it's a tremendous idea. And to Tom's point about this may not apply to the economic migrants, one might make the case that kleptocracies themselves, by the massive plundering of their economies, all kinds of corruption, $1.5 trillion industry by a 2010 UN estimate, that they could be held to account too on the economic migrations. Are there precedents in going after massive corruption legally for redress that could be part of this class action suit opportunity?
So I take Mark to be asking, could we bring claims against those countries that are creating economic migrants? And I got to say, I was going to say this with regard to even just the straight up asylum seekers. Countries are going to dig in their heels, and they're going to say, danged if another country is going to judge me. This is international law. Every country feels like, some blustering guy on his front porch and says, what happens in my house, none of your business, in my family. That's the way countries treat their people. So I think even France and Germany, who you'd think would be very eager to get this program going, would hesitate there and say, I don't want Canada looking into my, imprisonment records on things and claiming I botched the economic program. There's just no way countries are going to open themselves up to liability there. They're all going to close ranks and say, nobody's suing anybody. We're the nation states. That's where I'm afraid this would go.
Yeah, I mean, there'd have to be a law that you can point to that the country violated that's enforceable internationally. So that's like the Alien Tort Claims Act or something is like a great vehicle for doing that, because then you can sue for torts that were committed abroad in other countries in U.S. courts.
Yeah, only in the United States. It's not international law, so.
Right. Yeah. But like these sort of domestic laws that have like an international reach like that would be kind of interesting mechanisms for doing that. So with that, with like a claim having to do with corruption or something like that, where it would get down to the specifics of like what law is out there that could apply to this particular instance. And
If I can just jump in on it, because I'm surprised you didn't mention this, Mike. You mind if I? There is this financing mechanism that exists in the EU. Maybe you can't talk about your work on this front, but one can imagine a country in Europe. Well, this happens in the EU. They say to countries like Greece, you're supposed to be taking in these asylum seekers, everybody in Europe, and economic migrants too. It's a big problem in the EU. Everyone's got to carry their fair share of this burden. We all bear it. And some countries just aren't. And so the EU has said, we're going to fine you so many dollars per day for every economic migrant you turn away. You're supposed to take them. Well, it's really expensive. We can't afford it. Well, look at our fine. That's expensive too. And this creates a financial incentive for a country to maybe go to Libya and say, we're going to face a ton of fines from the EU if we keep dealing with economic migrants this way. Can you help us, Libya? Could you maybe have a camp on your southern border to catch some of these people? We'll pay you, because otherwise the EU is going to fine us. It's a little bit like what you're saying, but now we don't have to have this claim. Under international law, you got to create this new claim and have a hedge fund. You just don't deal with that. The EU, at least in this instance, has set up maybe a funding mechanism. I guess Michael's not going to say anything more.
No, it's good. Oh,
Sorry.
That-
Mike, Bob, please. Mike.
We should follow the rules of order here, and there's forcibly displaced people. No, worldwide. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Closer. Put it next to your mouth. That's the part that makes noise. There you go. Yeah.
There we go.
There we go.
So for cases such as unaccompanied children, which in the U.S. Get designated as unaccompanied children or sent to a shelter, and then they find a sponsor for them, either a U.S. citizen or someone. So how would it handle that situation? If they were to live in a refugee city, would they have access to their sponsor, during that waiting period for their hearing or their interview? Because usually they're allowed to go live with their sponsor. So how would it handle that waiting period? And then my second question is regarding highly educated asylum seekers and regarding their employment. So if they're educated as doctors or lawyers or from the country they're coming from, would they be able to exercise those careers in that specific city, or what type of educational background would they need to exercise the careers they studied for?
I'll go in reverse order and answer that question first. I think ideally with a refugee city, we have a wide range of industries and business activities happening, and it's like a full-fledged city with a range of different activities happening. That's the ideal scenario. What may happen, what may need to happen is an interim step, is it's more like an industrial park, and where the range of employment opportunities are much more limited. We want to create a space in which doctors can be doctors and lawyers can be lawyers and accountants can be accountants. And I think that by creating these spaces, we might just open the door for countries to begin, it's like somebody has been working in this special zone for a number of years. Maybe it becomes more attractive for them to be working in the host country eventually, and so they can say, yeah, you can move to Berlin or some big city and you can practice your profession there. So yes, I would like to see that. As far as unaccompanied minors, I haven't honestly thought about this very much within the United States, how it would work in that type of situation. But yeah, if an unaccompanied minor were to be entering the refugee city, first of all, NGOs would play, and international organizations would play a very crucial role. It's not like just because we're creating a space in which economic opportunities are happening and we're attracting investment, that those are the only things happening. Still a huge role for public entities or donor organizations to be setting up means of providing for people who can't provide for themselves and who are vulnerable, especially vulnerable people. And it's especially all the more crucial in a place in a refugee city, because you've got an extremely vulnerable population that doesn't have any other option, and which means that leaves them more open to abuse. So yeah, with unaccompanied minors, you'd have the best practices in caring for kids, and if there's some pathway within the country for them to find a sponsor family and to go live with them, then yes, we shouldn't impede that, certainly. The goal of a refugee city is to be expanding freedom for people, not to be limiting it. So yeah, so if there's a better option at the national level, then yes, it's the second best solution, like we were saying.
My question is for Professor Bell. You were starting to talk about what would be the ideal situation in the way to use these SEZs rather than just allowing, for example, France to say, now you're a pod in yourself and just not going unregulated. So what exactly would you propose in order to best utilize the SEZs?
Thank you, Ms. Park. So I'll take the question to be sort of maybe how France could make things better, and I will pick France because I want to give them some credit. I've kind of picked on them a little bit. I give them credit as being pioneers in kind of a mad scientist kind of way. I totally respect that. But maybe they haven't taken it in the right direction. However, France has actually eased up in terms of giving outsiders access. So to answer your question directly, Ms. Park, I'd say we should allow, if France is not going to serve these populations, we should open it up to the international community. We say, France, if you're going to say this is outside of your territory for purposes of immigration, you should have nothing to say about some international organizations coming in and landing at the airport too and going and helping those people. And France has eased up. They've changed the rules in part as a result of litigation like Amber versus France, but also because of domestic NGOs and human rights workers. They say, France, what you're doing isn't right. We want to get access to those people. We want to give them counseling. There's been back and forth and public debate, and France has given up some ground. So I think that trend needs to continue. And again, I would hit the gas pretty hard to get us quickly to a world where special international zones are not just places where governments say, we're going to leave our police force in place and roll back on liberties. It seems to me you should also have to roll back your police force and allow others to come render aid, so that you really are in an international area instead of something that looks an awful lot like a camp, a prison camp. Now, I got to address that too, because here I have some sympathy for France. France has said, these people are not detained. It's not a prison. The door is open back home. It's more like a dead end. It's a little bit like these people are like pushed up against the gate from the pressure from behind, and they're looking at the fence. They say, let me through, and France says, we're not going to let you through. But they can always turn around and walk back. They're not in a prison. Now, the answer to that, and Amber versus France addressed that, is that's not a real option for these people. They're not going to go back home. They don't want to. But France has said, with some justice, I think, they're not imprisoned. And while they're here, we can't have them wander around the airport. We got to have them, secured. Still, France has moved towards giving more access to those people as long as they are on French soil, and I think they need to take that farther.
Thanks for a really stimulating panel. What would be the ideal solution? Should the countries freely allow anyone and everyone and any number of people to come into their areas? Do they have a legitimate interest and right to ask of anything of these people? For example, that they can at least support themselves, or if not, that someone in the region will commit to supporting them, maybe a family member or friend or whatever. What would be the ideal in your view?
Stab at it, but you want to?
Well, I'll say I'm going to I'm going to dodge that question a little bit.
Yeah, me too.
And the reason is because I'm going to try to stick to sort of the pragmatics of what I'm trying to promote with the Refugee Cities question. And it is very clear that countries, if countries were to expand economic opportunities, expand economic rights for migrants more than they are, that there would be net economic benefits for the country. It would benefit the country for doing that. Your question is, should we open the door to everybody to come in, which is a very complex question that requires a very complex and sophisticated answer that I am not prepared to give.
I'm going to mostly dodge it too. I'll say, you said should, and again, I'll address it in terms of law. I do think there's lots to say about this, on an ethical front. Some people think there should be no national borders at all. They think passports are just an abomination, that we should be free to travel everywhere. But I'll just say that's not the way international law works now. In theory, a country could, even if it signed the Asylum Convention, it could put up a fence around its country and say, we're going to go North Korea on this. Nobody's going to get on our soil to even claim asylum. We're going to shut ourselves off. No immigrants, nobody. And they could legally do that. It would be economic suicide, as North Korea shows, but under international law, countries can drive themselves into a ditch if they want to. I don't think it's good policy, and I think the sort of angel's mission that people like Michael, and people like Michael are on, is not to go to countries and scold them into doing the right thing. It just never works. Instead, show them. This is going to make you better off. There's a controlled way you can help these people whom you want to help, because you see suffering, without making your electorate furious. There's a controlled way to do that. You can do good without losing the next election. That's the only way it's going to happen. That's legal, and it's a step in the right direction. For me, in this world of woes, that's good enough for me. It's a step in the right direction.
I do want to add to the question a little bit. There are attempts, not just in law review articles and academia where we can just sort of explore every crazy idea, right? But even in the world of, especially in the world of academia, for example, Martha Nussbaum from Chicago has been talking about a more cosmopolitan world in which citizenship is global. I don't know whether we'll ever get there, but there's a lot of serious academic scholarship on the notion of global citizenship rather than one based on nationality and territoriality. But from a more pragmatic standpoint, there are countries, from what I can tell, such as Honduras and others, I think, that have created or trying to create huge cities, charter cities, startup cities, where totally different rules will apply. And I can imagine one of those enclaves would be emulating, let's say, Hong Kong in the 1800s. Right? And it would be a situation where the country itself would exercise its sovereignty to give up its sovereignty. Right? So it's not like another country is going in and say, we're taking it from you, but they're saying, you know, we are having a lot of trouble and we're going to do this lab, and we're, in order to attract investment and the best, anybody who's willing to work, we're going to suspend everything. So we're just going to allow international law to take place. Anybody can come in. If a multinational investor wants to hire you, we don't care what your nationality is, it's open immigration. So I think Honduras is experimenting with that. I don't know how far it's going. I'm still looking into the details. But yes, right, it would be no national laws at all. We give it up. We promise to give it up, and we cannot change our mind. In case the next election cycle comes, no, we cannot change our mind. It would need, like 90% of the Honduran legislature, I'm making up that number, to reverse what we're trying to do. Mm-hmm. So in that enclave, every no nationality issues would be independent, would be free movement of workers.
On the question of should, what does should mean? I think what would be most useful would be some kind of survey of, a historical survey of what has turned out well in the past and what has failed in the past, and see if we can make some generalizations or inferences from that. I can well imagine that it might depend in part on the numbers of people and the percentages relative to the existing population, and that if you have too many people who enter an area who have a very different idea of laws and rules and so forth than the people who are already there, that there's a phase change that happens if the percentages exceed some threshold, and that could very significantly change society for that region. And understanding those dynamics, I would think, might well be good for illuminating whatever policy.
I agree. That'd be an interesting empirical study. I suspect what you'd find, because you'd be looking in the past, of course, it's a historical study, is a strong correlation between liberalism in immigration and economic growth. However, let us note, those economic studies might miss a couple of interesting things that might make things different today. One, it's a lot easier to travel to foreign countries today. 8-hour flight and you've made it across the ocean. Back in the day when the United States took a lot of immigrants from Europe, only the strong survived. The really motivated people were the only ones who tried the journey. It was daunting. It was often deadly. We weren't getting people who, I can't get a job here. I'm kind of bored and my kids aren't getting a great education. I'm going to go to the next country. People who aren't really as dedicated, perhaps, to getting to the new country as in times past. And that's going to change the type of immigrant. Also, back then, you went to America, you were on your own. You were going to learn English because you weren't making calls home to mom. You weren't on FaceTime. You were in a new world. And now people can move to a new country and pretty much maintain their ties with home. That's a beautiful thing in a lot of ways, but it means they're not as integrated culturally as quickly. So I don't know how much we can generalize from the past. The technologies have perhaps changed the nature of immigration, the nature of becoming a native. I'm just not certain. I just don't know.
So both of you discussed how we can use these SEZs for good and really create these spaces for refugees. And I was just wondering how and if or when a zone like that would end. So if we have these refugees and these, economic migrants living in these places and they create lives there and set up families, would they want to make that space a country? Like, how would it ever end, or would it
How will they ever
end?
How will they ever end?
Yeah.
Oh, if you set up like a refugee city, how will it end?
What happens 20, 30, 40 years from now?
I'll answer that, but I think that's really to you. You set them up. You got to figure out what happens.
Do I?
No, maybe not.
No, because that's the thing, right? I mean, so if you need like an end game for something like this in order to implement it, you can say, well, there's many different ways that it could go. One is you can put a time limit on it, and you could say, you could have some metric that says like let's say in the case of Syria or something, some metric that says once a certain level of stability is reached or something, a conflict has died down, then everybody's got to go home or something, right? You can bake it into like the agreement that's formed with whatever entity is developing this thing. So if you've got a developer, some type of public-private partnership or something that's owning the land, and it can be like a 20, 30, 40-year concession agreement or something that says you get to use the zone for this number of years, and after that, whether we renew it or not is up to us. And so you can sort of bake in an end date that way. But on the other hand, you could imagine if it's so that especially might happen if the zone isn't very successful, right? Like it's not a very economically productive place. But on the other hand, you could look at it as a transitional step towards greater integration, So because after people have been working there for a certain number of years of their life, they've made some money, they're successful, they're business owners themselves, they're employing people in your own country. Those are the type of people you really want to get rid of. And so maybe the city kind of gets integrated with the rest, the fabric of the country as a whole. But that's up to the country that is implementing it.
I can just add, those are good answers. I'll just say two things. One is, I think many countries would worry that, you say now in 20 years you're going to kick them out, but we know what happens. This is going to be a city, and people are going to intermarry, and we just won't be willing to do that, and it's going to change the fabric of our country. We see that now. In 20 years, they're going to fold, and I don't want my country to become that way. People could say that. So all I can say is you'd have to give them, either change their minds, you're going to learn to love Syrians. And I really do think people would. They would intermarry, and they'd get over it. But you got to tell them now when they're feeling xenophobic, it's going to be okay. That's a hard sale to make. The other thing I'll say is I've been working with seasteaders, and I will say the seasteaders have got a nice, neat solution to this. I mean, this is not what the seasteaders, they're building a project now in French Polynesia that is not going to be, it's not going to have anything to do with refugees. But there has been talk about creating floating platforms. The seasteaders are all about building islands the size of cities people can live on. Well, if you could do that, that would solve a ton of problems. You say, well, that's a big if, but that's what they're working on. You say, Syrians, you need a place to go. We're going to put you on this. It's really nice, this floating city. It'll be off the coast of Lebanon. And this gives the Lebanese a good feeling about how they're not actually taking our soil. And at the end of 20 years, we can actually attach a tug to it, and we can move it. And the Syrians might like that too. It's not like the Syrians are saying, let's have a civil war so we can go live in Lebanon. They want to go home. Most of them, and they get roots and they end up settling, but they long for the homeland, most of them, if they could just get rid of the thugs back home. I don't know, if you could move them around, it'd be a lot more convenient. I know that's kind of a sci-fi scenario, but he answered the question in a kind of very practical way, and I got to give you something to think about as well. So
that's your job. So actually, and I just thought of another thing on that too. It just so happens that a lot of the countries that are hosting huge refugee populations have it urgent need for more urban space anyway. They need, like, their cities are like growing like crazy, and because the city isn't well planned, or they're not managing that growth well, it's a lot of like informal settlements and slums that are kind of popping up, and so there's not good infrastructure built in advance, not good services delivered. A refugee city could be a way to put permanent infrastructure in the ground that the city needs anyway, especially if it's adjacent to a big growing city. So 20, 30 years from now, like, that's all that new space that you just developed. It's not like if you kick out all the refugees, it's going to be empty, because the city's grown out to expand all of it.
That makes for a great scenario. You can imagine, like the Lebanese say, okay, we'll take some Syrians. And the Syrians get there, and they end up with a really nice city. So in 20 years, the Lebanese are going, hey, can we move in with you? You guys have a really nice city over there. And then
right.
Wouldn't it be nice to turn the
Exactly.
table?
Mark?
Are we, yeah, one more question?
Sure.
How are we on time, Cindy? Okay,
Oh, okay.
excellent.
Partly in response to what John had mentioned about a tipping point before things get really different. Dubai, if I recall, 80% of the population is of economic migrants, basically, who are paying, in the Emirates as a whole, close to $1 billion a year for work permits and visas. So there's real money in that. It's inspired many other countries to open up and experiment, as Tom points out in his book, with move toward polycentric systems and of law, giving choice. So it really does seem to be an example that could be replicable and very profitable for a host country, with a partnership potentially with Dubai to set up a similar system. And in terms of the end game for large-scale free zones or world cities, there are precedents for what are called build, operate, transfer concessions, where you get risk-taking private developers putting in a port, put an airport, roads. In some cases, whole zones have been operated on a build, operate, transfer concession. And sometimes it's like a cliff where 30 years later it changes. Or in the case of Hong Kong, 99-year build, operate, transfer. But the trend has been toward a progressive 2% per year transferred to the local partners. So in this way, potentially billions of dollars worth of infrastructure is conveying over to the community and to the residents who might otherwise, be worried what's in it for them.
I think that's awesome, describing those rich financiers who moved to Dubai as economic migrants. They are. They're at the other end of the income scale, yeah.
Hi. In regards to like refugee cities and education, I wonder how you would ensure the children, refugees in these cities get equal education or fair education, and then taking it a step further, do refugee cities start their own universities, or are these children, eventually adults, able to attend universities in the host country, or what?
And education is another issue that comes up with the Refugee Convention too, because they have certain rights regarding education. But, again, this is like an answer that's sort of like, I want to get the best that I can, and as many opportunities for refugees to get as good of an education as they can. So, at the very least, we have organizations that are providing education within the city for people. Hopefully, we can get people to have the right to get an education at the university, the leading universities in the country too, and maybe even rights elsewhere in other countries. And we're seeing this a lot too. Actually, there's the UN has like 3 like sort of goals with refugees. One is repatriation when it's safe to do so, when they can go back home. Another one is resettlement in a third country. So if being, getting resettled in Germany or United States. Less than 1% of refugees globally are resettled into third countries. So it's like winning the lottery. And there is, or integration into the country that's hosting them. And all three of those happen very rarely, and which is why people will spend like 10, 20 years of their life like in limbo that whole time. So there's all the complementary pathways that are developing because those three solutions aren't viable. And one of those complementary pathways is like countries are beginning to set up little special arrangements where, a refugee that they're hosting in a camp, or that's in a camp in Lebanon or something, a German university, the government of Germany allows them to attend university in Germany if they qualify for the school and everything. So there's all these kind of special arrangements that are sort of emerging to deal with the issue.
So I'm thinking of the problem of timing, right? So a refugee situation, let's say we're talking about refugee or sort of dire economic migration, flares up between two countries. You have a bunch of people who've crossed the border. They're in a camp, formal or informal. When would a refugee city mobilize? At what point in time do you create a refugee city? And maybe part of what I'm asking is a refugee city a kind of symbolic idea, or is there also physical infrastructure that goes with it?
Yes, it's both a concept but it's a concept that can take many different forms. So one way of describing it is a sort of a refugee-inclusive special economic zone, which would be a place with infrastructure and services and stuff provided for people, with residential, industrial, and commercial uses all happening there. As far as timing, it's like let's say there's some conflict erupts and a bunch of people are crossing the border. Oftentimes in that case, you're either taking a refugee camp or an informal settlement that's popped up and maybe kind of allowing some organic economic growth to happen and building in the infrastructure later. Or maybe you're taking the informal settlement that's popped up over here, but you've got vacant land over here that you can build in. You can lay out some basic infrastructure, subdivide it into plots fairly quickly. Maybe put in some temporary shelters that are able to be built easily, but then lease out the plots to the individual residents so that they can move in and maybe build up themselves, build up their own homes, build up places to do business in.
I would say this is a little bit of a rhetorical trick, but I'd say refugee cities are already happening now. It's just being done really badly at a small scale. And, part of the research that I've done is to open people's eyes to this and say, this is happening. France is doing this. I haven't done the numbers, the head count, but they have many thousands of people in camps in their country, walking around their country, who are not really there. And as a consequence, the timeline, I could imagine that maybe we need something like a refugee convention, an international agreement between countries to kind of hold them to task. Because if you're going to do this trick, France, we understand, that's okay, you can do it. But if you're going to shut them out of your immigration territory on your soil, there ought to be some more protections for them. And not just refugees. Asylum seekers are a very narrow number of the people who need help. That's further down the line. But, that's happening now. It's being done kind of badly. Maybe something like the Refugee Convention could help in this area, too.
We only have 1 minute left, so we're happy to want to just thank you, the panel, on a really fantastic presentation that is very uplifting and provocative both. Thank you.
Thank you. Uplifting. All right, you did that. That is inspiring. You hear about